So people define fluency in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of comments that are said about it. So I wanted to share a couple of the biggies very quickly before we start. The most common definition for fluency is the ability to read smoothly, easily, and readily with freedom from word recognition errors. You've probably heard that definition before. More recently, Jan Hasbrook and Deb Glaser did a sort of a nuanced definition. You're probably familiar with the Hasbrook and Tyndall or reading fluency norms. Jan did those. She's done a ton of great work in the area of fluency along with Deb Glaser. And their definition of fluency is reasonably accurate reading at an appropriate rate, not too fast, not too slow, with suitable expression that leads to accurate and deep comprehension and motivation. We struggle getting through text. We're not highly motivated to try it again with other texts, as I think you'll agree. And we'll dig into that a little bit more. Fluency is an outcome of the mastery of underlying skills, not a skill by itself. So we're going to talk a lot about those underlying skills. In fact, the first half is going to be about those underlying skills. And then the second half, we're going to talk about lots of really fun things you can do in your classroom around fluency, like reader's theater and all kinds of things like that. And most people refer to fluency as the bridge to comprehension. You probably heard that before. And what's really interesting in the science of reading movement, there are these models of reading that everyone's seeing and everyone's talking about. The two biggies are the simple view of reading and Scarborough's reading rope, which I have on the screen side by side. And there are these two big buckets, the decoding bucket and the language comprehension bucket. In order for us to understand or comprehend what we read, it's a product of what we're doing in those two big buckets, decoding and language comprehension. When we think about the decoding bucket, phonics plays a really important role there. When we think about the language comprehension bucket, you see vocabulary, background, language structures like syntax and so on, which we'll talk about later as well. You hear a lot of people talk about knowledge building curriculum. You hear a lot of people talk about read alouds organized in knowledge building text sets and so on. So there's a lot of analysis of these big buckets. But more recently, Nell Duke and Kelly Cartwright came out with their active view of reading. I don't know if you're familiar with that. This came out, I think it was during the pandemic when we were all sort of trapped at our homes. But one of the things that they talked about, and if you look at these two big buckets, the word recognition bucket on top and the language comprehension on the bottom, there's this part in the middle, these bridging processes that connect those two. And they are incredibly important. They are very impactful and they require a lot of our attention. And if you look at the second thing underneath the bridging processes is reading fluency. It truly is that bridge, and this model of reading shows that. They also talk about vocabulary. They talk about morphological awareness. The morpheme is the smallest unit of meaning. We'll talk a little bit about that later. It's very important for both vocabulary and spelling as we move into the upper elementary grades and beyond. They talk about being flexible, using all those skills that we have. You might have heard the term set for variability. So for example, if you're seeing a word and it has the EA spelling, it could be long E, it could be short E, it could be long A. Sometimes we have to try and be ready to be flexible in our sound spellings to arrive at the word that it truly is. These are all things that we spend a ton of time focusing in on at the lab schools I'm in our grades 3, 4, and 5. And so there's a lot that we can do in this area to support our students. At a very basic level, when we think about phonics and we think about comprehension, there is sort of this sequence that we go through. And think about me just learning how to read Hebrew. We started with phonics. There are these strange squiggles and lines and dashes and dots, and I had to learn the sounds for those. The better I got at remembering those sound spellings, the better I was at decoding or accessing the words on the page. We know that when we look at the letters, we say the sounds, we put the sounds together, we attach the meaning, that we are orthographically mapping those words into memory so that we can automatically retrieve them. And the more words that we can automatically retrieve, the better our word recognition and the better the rate is at which we can get through the text that we're reading. So it has a positive effect on our reading fluency. There is this correlation that we'll talk about later as well between fluency and comprehension. You know, when you're reading more complex sentences as you move through the grades, you really do have to get through enough words quickly enough to form a meaningful unit, or it's really difficult to understand what you're reading. And so being automatic with these underlying skills is so critical to the success of our students. And we encounter so many students in upper elementary who just aren't there yet, and we have to do some additional things to support them. So back in the early 2000s, I thought fluency was going to be the next hot thing. So I wrote a whole book about fluency, and I created a fluency program with so many amazing educators and researchers like Marianne Wolf, who's done so much great work in the area of fluency and the area of dyslexia. If you ever get a chance to hear her speak or use any of her resources, please do. Not only is she absolutely brilliant, but she is a wonderful human being. It's a pleasure to get to work with her back then. I did research studies on it to look at what we were doing and the resources and the techniques to show positive impact and put it out in the world, and crickets. No one seemed that interested. And it's so fundamental to being a skilled reader. I don't know why, but it's really interesting. About 25 years later, there's this renewed focus. And I'm really, really happy because there's so many things that we can do to ensure fluency for our beginning readers. And there are so many fun things that we can do that we can incorporate into our instruction that really can help to move the needle. So here we are. Those of you who have been in education, I just finished my 38th year. So those of you who've been a long time, you see these things happen, but I'm excited that this one is happening now. So fluency it must be a key part of a phonics program's DNA at that letter sound level, that word level, and the connected text level. And every lesson needs to have attention to all of those areas, and some don't. And I want to dig into that before we get to the fun stuff to make sure whatever resources you're using, that you have all of those things in place. And talk a little bit about some of the glitches that I'm seeing in the classrooms that I'm working in. So years ago, I was in schools and doing all this work about why phonics wasn't having the impact that it should. And I came up with my 10 reasons why phonics instruction sometimes fails. These are the 10 most common things that I saw, obstacles that we needed to fix with any curriculum. And the first one is always the one I addressed initially, and that's an inadequate or non-existent review and repetition cycle. Phonics programs have a lot of content. We're kind of racing through that content. And the reality is students don't master a skill, a new phonics skill in reading and writing in a week. Most of them don't. So when we introduce the skill, we have to systematically, explicitly, intentionally keep working on that skill for some students for the next 4 to 6 weeks to master it in both reading and writing. And it takes a lot longer in spelling, as you know. And if we don't do that, and we keep racing to the next and don't have that adequate review, that learning can slip away. It's what I refer to as decayed learning. We don't want that to happen. So we have to be vigilant, whatever resource we're using, to make sure that doesn't happen. And for those of you who aren't familiar with my 10 reasons why phonics instruction sometimes fails, I did write a literacy leadership brief for the International Literacy Association called Meeting the Challenges of Early Literacy Phonics Instruction. It's on their website. It's free. You can download it. There's also a version, those of you who are using Soundly products, there's a version of that you can look at. You can always contact me if you can't find it. It's very short. I often use it in schools that I'm starting to work with, just as sort of an overview of the key characteristics of strong phonics instruction, the 10 reasons why it sometimes fails, so we can identify areas of weakness and really target those right away. So it's a resource that you can take advantage of.